I am changing tack here and moving to the Financial Services Union. The General Secretary joins me now, John O'Connell. Good afternoon, John.
Hi, Ciara. Good afternoon.
Remote legislation, John, it's something that hasn't gone away, remote working, and yourselves and many others, including, IC2, IBEC, are saying that it's not necessary to have any remote working legislation in this country. Why do you say that?
Well, I think we actually have a different view. We think there is a requirement for legislation. IBEC have stated that they didn't see the need for legislation, but we feel that we're out of step with at least 12 other EU member states that have this legislation. And in New Zealand and the UK, they've had the legislation since 2014. So we think there's a bit of a catch-up to done to bring us into line. The government issued a draft bill, and during the week, the Oireachtas Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Employment was taking submissions on that. And we, as the collective in the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, made representation to that committee. And what we felt, Ciara, was that the legislation that's drafted is too employer-friendly. It doesn't recognise the reality of life over the past 2 years for all of us, and that the legislation needs some significant changes in order to make it palatable and acceptable to workers.
It's going to be very complex, whatever happens in regards to remote working, if there is legislation, if there's not, whatever it may be. I was speaking with Solicitor Richard Grogan there last week about remote working legislation. He was pointing out some of the basic things that I think most people probably will just go over their heads if you don't have a legal head about your shoulders. And that is simple things like, potentially, does it mean households will now have to get workplace insurance rather than just the normal house insurance? We're speaking with Peter Boland of the Alliance for Insurance Reform this morning, and I just briefly touched on that with him. And it seems as if this country, we're quite, it's quite bad in terms of damages when it does come to different issues around insurance and accidents or incidents that can happen in workplaces. So in terms of saying that it's more, I guess, beneficial of the employer at the moment, you can kind of half understand that when you do think about some employers being put out of business because they just cannot afford to renew insurance at the moment.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. And obviously that's not something that anybody supports in a situation of business going out of existence. I think it is a stretch too far, though, to draw a line between the cost of insurance and a piece of legislation which, in effect, just gives people the right to request. So there are issues in terms of remote working. Some people have been remote working for years. Thousands upon thousands of our members are remote working, some for years, but the vast majority over the past 2 years. And those issues of who's insured and so forth, that's the liability of the employer. It's the same as somebody who's working in an office and there's health and safety issues. It's the same liability that applies. I think rather than focus on the negative, and I think those issues have to be addressed, I think the positives around home working, improved work-life balance, particularly an increase that's demonstrated and been seen over the past 2 years, an increase in female participation in the workforce, reduction in stress and commute for people, greater sense of community. People felt and did shop locally and support local businesses. And of course, the government's development of local hubs which underpin people working remotely and getting to a situation of that blended working that we think is the way of the future.
John, do you envision this being easily solved, or I guess some sort of line being drawn underneath remote working and the need for legislation anytime soon? We have such big issues in the country post-pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, people. I think forget about that. A pandemic is still declared. We still have people obviously in the health service to do with COVID-19. We know about the waiting list. We're going to hear from a Kildare North TD in the next little while. And then obviously a lot of focus has gone on Ukraine in the past 9 days and their invasion of the country and how that's going to affect Europe going forward. Do you think something like this may, I guess, leave the mind of government quite easily? And what's the potential implication there, if so?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's something that everybody agrees that if we can get the mechanics of it right, is a really good thing for society and for all of us as workers. So in the first pandemic, over a quarter of the whole workforce in the country were able to work from home. And we've seen in terms of the economy that aside from sectors that had to close down, but the sectors that people operated in and worked remotely, that the economy thrived and continued to thrive. So there's two things, Ciara, that we think would really make this legislation much, much better. One is that in the current proposed legislation, there's 13 grounds on which an employer can rule you out from working remotely. And we think that's too broad. We think it should be narrow. And I think we also want that if I can provide evidence that I've worked remotely for the past 2 years, that it should be the case that's taken into account. And the second thing is that if we can't reach agreement with our employer, that there's an appeal mechanism there that allows for an appeal on the grounds of, as I said, that if I can produce evidence to show that my role is a role suitable for blended working, that I have somebody independently looking at that. For the vast majority of people, that won't arise because employers are, in the main, are reasonable and employees are reasonable. People are looking to come to an accommodation in relation to this. But for those employers that aren't in that category and maybe are just totally opposed to it, there has to be a legal mechanism to underpin my ability to request remote working and to have that heard. So that's what we're looking for, to bring us into line with other countries.
Okay, I appreciate your time this afternoon. That is John O Connell, General Secretary with the Financial Services Union there on remote legislation.